Hello, everybody. Pascal here from Neutrality Studies, and I would like to have a discussion with you about what happened in Japan this week because we've had two news items. The first one to point out is, of course, what we've learned yesterday that apparently the United States and Japan have reached a trade agreement about Japan investing more money into the US in return for only 15% additional tariffs on top of the tariffs they've already had. I will talk about this later because I think first we should actually also focus on the recent election that happened because there's a lot of talk about it, and I'm not entirely sure that people understand what precisely happened. I mean, if you follow Western media, then one of the main headlines or headline making events was that one of the right wing parties or the far right party actually gained a lot of seats, right? I mean, Reuters reports about it this here. Japanese First Party emerges as an election force with tough immigration talk. And here's a little video. Hundreds celebrating big wins for Japan's far-right San Seto Party. And in the background, you see probably the Mr. Kamiya, the leader of that party. Now, this might give you the impression, as this article here also talks about, that Japan is on a very similar trajectory as is, like, let's say, Germany with the alternative for Deutschland, the right-wing AfD party, or the UK with Nigel Farage and the developments happening in Europe, right? Everybody moves to the right, so Japan is just the latest example of that, of electing a far right party. But that's not exactly what happened. As so often, Japan to the outside looks very similar to Europe, but under the hood, actually, different dynamics are shaping up. And let me maybe show you this one here. So let's go through the actual party arrangement and this election. Here you're seeing NHK World, how NHK is Japan's national broadcaster, right? How they covered the news here with Mr. Ishiba being the prime minister and also the leader of Japan's largest party, the Conservative Party, that has been in power for the longest time, since basically the 1960s, with brief interludes in 1993 and a larger, longer interlude in 2009 to 2012. 13, when an opposition party for the first time came really into power. But the thing is, also Japan is not very good at explaining its own politics. Here, if you look at the chart that they give you down here, they explain the different, the party composition. You see. Or let me maybe start with this. What we witnessed on last Sunday, over the weekend, was not a general election. It was not an election of Japan's larger and more powerful lower chamber of parliament. It was an election of half of the upper chamber. So Japan has this funny system in which the upper chamber is elected in two different cycles, 50% every 3 years. So you have, with the idea, of course, that this creates a system where you then have upper house more or less stability, and minor changes over time, which is why upper house elections are usually not that largely covered in international media, because they tend not to have that huge an impact on Japan's domestic politics. But this time things are slightly different because of a general shift in the composition of how the parties work together. So just here for your information, by the way, I will use Wikipedia as a data source here, and this is of course something that any good academic tells you must not use Wikipedia, and it is absolutely true. Wikipedia comes with a lot of problems, but one thing that Wikipedia, in my experience, is just really very good is data aggregation for elections and also economic data. I just haven't seen a moment when we have properly conducted elections under a properly functioning electoral authority, where then on Wikipedia you would have very massive spin or misrepresentation. So usually Wikipedia, when it comes, to this kind of tables and stuffs that are issued by, let's say, trustworthy authorities, where we don't need to doubt the legitimacy of an election itself or of the election, the process. In general, I haven't seen a moment when Wikipedia data was like just far completely off. You cannot trust Wikipedia when it comes to issues like Syria or Iran or what's happening in Gaza and so on, because there people will put tons and tons of spin. But when we have this kind of very highly factual data as a source, Wikipedia just is very, very quick at aggregating things, and it's quite useful in order to get an overview of what is happening. So for that reason, I will show you the upper house here and the lower house, both as they stand on graphics in Wikipedia, because that's another thing the site does. It shows us these representations here, which are quite useful. Upper house has a total of 248 seats. And again, only half of these seats were contested this time. The lower house with more power is larger, 465 seats. And in both cases, Japan uses a proportional system to vote. A proportional system. It uses a mixed system to vote. What does that mean? It means that parts of the seats are allocated through a so-called first past the post system, where you have like one constituency, one little circle, right, of one district, and whoever wins the most votes in that district gets to get the seat, right? So because you have the individuals running for these seats, and whoever wins the most goes, and that's the first past the post system. Now, in both the upper and the lower house, about 2/3. It's a bit of a complicated system, but about 2/3 of seats are reserved, are allocated through this first past the post system with one single, where you have one person who can win per district, and in the rest, about 1/3 of seats will be allocated in a district, in constituencies where several people in a much larger district can win and will go and get seats, and that's a proportional system. So not just the first person wins, but the second, the third can also still have chances to get in, and depending on how much overall support for a party there will be additional seats allocated for people from those larger constituencies, from those larger districts. So, long story short, what this does, this mixed proportional and first past the post system, is, in general, it works in favor of the one or two largest parties. Any kind of first past the post system, especially look at how it works in the UK, right? For their parliamentary elections. Any first past the post system tends to benefit the largest party the most, because if it's quite simple, the most popular party tends to be most popular all over the country, and if all over the country you get let's say you're the most popular party at 30-35% of votes, and everybody else, usually in all the districts, gets slightly less, gets only 28 or 29, and is still the one with 30 or 35 gets the seat and wins, which means that you can win a lot of seats, 2/3 of seats or even more in parliament, despite the fact that you only have about 1/3 of people who support you. But because across the board, your people tend to win slightly more than everybody else gets nothing and you get everything. So a first past the post system benefits the most popular party, even if the most popular party is only at 30-35% or so, it can translate into massive gains. And although Japan has a mixed system, it's still the overall electoral system still works in that kind of skewed way, which is why for the longest time the Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP, actually had a massive control over both houses of parliament, because they were just the most popular party at 30, 35, sometimes 40% of votes, and that would translate into sometimes over 60, over 66% majority in one or in both chambers. Now that is changing right now. And if we look at the distribution, so again, this is the lower house, the upper house, the one that we just had elections for. Here we've got the general election from last year, 2024, from the lower house elections. And you see that at the moment, here there's this two voting system, proportional and by constituency. And overall, last time in 2024, the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party, that's the green one over here, lost a lot of seats, minus 68. Whereas the Constitutional Democratic Party, they won 52 seats. They are here, the blue ones. And in general, you can think of the CDP as Japan's version of a large social democratic party. They used to be the Democratic Party of Japan, the DPJ. They were the party that was in power in 2009 to 12-13, when for the first time the LDP was kind of kicked out of power. Then they struggled a lot. Among other things, they had to manage the 2011 big earthquake against Fukushima, and those kind of events completely crushed them, and they were thrown out of power again very quickly. But they're still the second largest party, especially in the lower house. And then we've got other parties below that. And let me again go back to this graph here from the NHK. The reason why this graph is a little bit unlucky or unhappily made is because it puts the LDP here on the left-hand side and even colors it red, which would make you think that the LDP is the Liberal Democratic Party is the left-wing party, but it is not. The LDP is firmly a centrist right party. The green ones here again. I think this graph on Wikipedia is actually more useful because they are somewhere on the political spectrum here in the center right, a conservative party. The closest thing in European politics, I think, you can compare the LDP with the German CDU, and you can compare the Constitutional Democratic Party with the SPD, but they have very, very, very different preferences, but it's the closest kind of comparison to Europe, I would argue. I made a little graph as well. So proud. Good old PowerPoint. To kind of explain where these different parties fall. And this is an approximate graph. The size roughly represents how big they are, although not totally. I had to make the Liberal Democratic Party a little bit longer just in order to represent how wide the spectrum of people is inside this inside this party. The one thing to know about the LDP, the Conservatives, Mr. Ishiba's party, is that they include a lot of people with various political preferences. We have people like Mr. Ishiba, who's actually more or less at the left, on the left wing, and not far left, but at the well in the left part of his party. And we have other people who, for instance, contested Mr. Ishiba a year ago for leadership, and Miss Takaichi is her name. She would be on the far right part of her own party, and all of these people, these different factions. And Japan, although it abolished factions, the LDP abolished its factions officially last year. Obviously such a large party is still split up into different groups, right? And it's just to say, like, the LDP, although it looks like a monolith, is made out of different policy preferences. Then for the longest time, the LDP had this habit of partnering up with a smaller party, the Kometo, which is basically a religious inspired political party that is not that huge. You know, the Komeito was never a big party. Let's look at them here in the lower house. In the lower house, the Komeito, they always poll around. They get supported by around 5 to 6 million Japanese, right? Out of 120 million in the country, and out of a voting population of somewhere around, I forgot, the voting population must be around 60, 70 million, probably 67, yeah, 70, 80 million, something there. And they get support by around 5 million people. And that then usually translates into an overall, a couple of, not even that many seats, like 20, 30, sometimes 40 seats, 10% or so of the, less than 10% usually of the whole parliament are taken by Komeito. But there is this habit of the LDP of allying with them and creating a coalition party, even when the LDP doesn't need that. The LDP actually had even a absolute majority, 66% majority back in the days of Mr. Abe, but they still decided to maintain this coalition with Komeito and appoint one or two Komeito ministers in the cabinet. Because they ideologically align pretty well. And then we've got the opposition parties, and I didn't list all of them here. These are the main ones that I think we need to keep in mind from now on. The smallest one I actually included is the Japanese Communist Party, and I put them here because there's other parties that are even slightly bigger, some of the small ones, but the communists are such a long-standing fixture of Japan's political party spectrum. They've just always been around, and they campaign every single year, and they do it wholeheartedly, and they always give you good old communist slogans and redistribution, and we don't care, and we need a proletarian revolution, and we need they do this wholeheartily, and they don't have a lot of support, but they've been around forever, and they are of course on the far left and that traditional literally communist party, not just socialist but communist party, but they never win very much support. Again, if we go to the let's go to the upper house, you see the communists, they poll much less even than the Komeito, than the religious party, right? At around 3 million, and that has been more or less consistent. And sometimes they win a few seats, and this time and over the last couple of periods they lost seats, but overall they're around. Then the main opposition party, or the one considered the main opposition party, is the Constitutional Democratic Party. Again, the old DPJ, now CDP. They are like a social democratic kind of set up redistributive measures with now a very, very strong emphasis on guarding the constitution. That's why they put the constitutional in there. Their part of how they define themselves is that they stand in opposition to the previous LDP idea of revising the Japanese constitution. You need to know the Japanese constitution was never, ever revised in its over 70 years history, and this was of course the constitution which was largely written by the Americans, and the constitution which in Article 9 includes the famous war renouncing article, saying like Japan renounces war as a practice of a sovereign state, and it will therefore not maintain a army. It will not maintain military forces. Now The LDP under Mr. Abe, the previous prime minister who got assassinated after he was out of office, absolutely, completely, utterly useless form of political violence. But anyhow, Mr. Abe, he had a plan while while he had control over 66% of parliament to change the Japanese constitution and get rid of paragraph 2 of Article 9. He never actually wanted to get rid of the renouncing of war of the article, but what he wanted to get rid of is of the part that says Japan will not maintain military forces, because the actual military forces it does have are called self-defense forces, and Mr. Abe and others on the right side of the LDP, they always wanted to imagine Japan's military and make a proper, a normal military, a normal navy, and a normal air force, because right now Japan has a ground self-defense forces, air self-defense forces, and maritime self-defense forces, which come with stringent constitutional constraints. And they wanted to change that. This is why people talk about the LDP sometimes as the, a radical party, that a militaristic party. Although also that perception, in my view, is overblown. And Mr. Mr. Abe never managed to do that, even though he had 66% of parliament, which is what you need under the Japanese constitution to change the constitution. But there's a second thing you need under the Japanese constitution, which is you also need to hold a referendum. So you also need 50% of support in the general population if you actually want to change the constitution. And it was always clear that he would probably be defeated at the ballot box if there was an actual referendum about this. So that's why we still have the Japanese constitution unchanged, the way that it was, the way that it always was. And right now we have never been further away from successful change of the constitution, because the LDP is losing power over time. But it is losing power to these other parties, and not just the Constitutional Democratic Party, also this relatively fresh one, at least in its current size, the Democratic Party for the People, the DPP. Has now about the same kind of voter support as the CDP, and the Democratic Party is a center right party, that basically a conservative party that stands for the protection of traditional values, very similar to some of the LDP goals actually, but they try to differentiate themselves by being not the LDP, because the LDP is also riddled with scandals recently. Then we've got still among the opposition parties the Ishin no Kai, the Japan Innovation Party, which was a new party back in about 10 years ago that originated in Osaka and was very much built around the personal prestige of its founder, Mr. Hashimoto, and they are a pretty right-wing party. They gained support they gained also national support then 7-8 years ago and won a couple of seats. People, funnily enough, already back then when Ishin won on the national stage, it was reported exactly the way it is being reported today about the new right-wing party, this one, the Sanseto. It was reported that, oh my God, Japan is moving right. The right-wing extremists are winning seats in the national election. But what then usually happens is that the party also then deflates again, either because they have like internal power struggles, and or because the voter base still then tends in follow-up elections tend to melt away again. So in Japan, we've never had a moment when a right-wing party over a seriously long time, I mean more right than the LDP, managed to stay in power, manage its size for more than a couple of years. And right now, what we're seeing is the rise of the Sanseto, which is even further right, I would say, than Ishin when it comes especially to issues of migration. They made a name for themselves being anti-immigrant. Being again Japan first. They copy as part of the of the speech of the speeches of the way the America First movement brands itself, and the anti-immigrant rhetorics like xenophobic. They exploit a couple of news items that we had. I mean, there is this kind of there is a famous kind of violent criminal gang in Saitama, and a couple of dozens or 100 people, and these kind of like criminality, foreigner criminality, which in Japan is quite low, but they still manage to make headlines. And you need to know Japan's foreign population is still below 3%, at or below 3% of the entire country. I mean, Japan's foreign population is extremely low for a developed global north country, but still there is criminality, and there are a couple of problems, and Sanseto was riding on those. So I think these are the main kind of parties to keep in mind. Now, what is new in after this upper house elections is that we see gains for these other parties, and relative loss of the LDP. What we traditionally used to have is a large ruling party together in a small coalition, and then a relatively large opposition party that but out of power. And now this is the thing that kind of that seems to be changing inside Japan. So the LDP losing quite a bit of support. Again, it was only half of the seats contested, but the LDP lost 13 of those. This Democratic Party, the DPP, they won 13. The Sanseto gained 14 from up from 1. Right, from having had originally 1. So that's why the media then reports this as a massive gain, because proportionally speaking, the Sanseto had the largest win of seats in the upper house elections. I mean, going from 1 to 14 is huge, right? For being a new party. But again, this is one of these patterns that we've seen also before with Ishin, that yes, you can win big once, but then you stagnate on that level, or you even deflate again and disappear. So whether this one is here to stay is anybody's guess. And also, if just to make this clear, the Sanseto managed to attract a couple of people from the voters, not people, but voters from the right part of the LDP. So the LDP used to be this umbrella party that actually integrated even like very far right figures, and the fact that Mr. Ishiba and others who are currently on the left are rather are opposing a couple of their ideas also then means that the voter base on the right hand, they are looking for new places to go, right? So in a sense, we are not seeing a large revolution, and I don't think we're seeing a drifting of Japan towards right-wing extremism. No, what we are seeing is just voter migration and not a fracturing of the political system. I think the political system of Japan remains as it is, but we are seeing a diversification among the different parties, which, though the biggest impact it will have or currently has is that it will probably create the incentives for Parliament to actually have proper debates, because for the longest time the real debates happened within the LDP, and then the decisions there were just shoved down the throats, of course, of the opposition. But now we're nearing a moment, especially if the next general elections should go in the same direction, where these different parties are forced to talk to each other and are actually forced to have this larger debate within Parliament, and it's not going to be just an internal LDP decisions. So because you see the overall support among the population, let's just take this one here. On the national level, the LDP won the support of 12.8 million people, and then the DPP 7.6 million, Sanseto 7.4, Constitutional Democratic Party 7.3, Komento 5.2. So you see that we are now moving towards a place in which different Japanese parties have roughly comparable voter support, and this was for the LDP not a large problem as long as they were significantly the largest of a couple of smaller parties, as long as they won more than 35 or so percent of the voter base, they could rule completely. But now that they're sinking below 30, their approval is now somewhere around 24, 25%. The system, the electoral system the Japanese have now is at the tipping point where it creates a more or less equilibrated representation in parliament. Before it's just the largest one gets disproportionately a lot of say, and now we're at the point where the largest one lost so much support that it creates more or less a proportional parliament. And as you can see here in the upper house, we still have a moment in which the LDP doesn't have an overall majority, but it's still the largest. And then the Constitutional Democratic Party on the left, they are the second largest, and they are both of them are at the moment still disproportionately large. They are larger than what the voter base would want them or would suppose they are. And that if both of them in the next general election lose even just a bit of their voter base, it will lead to a proportional growing of the other ones, right? Hence, what we are currently witnessing is this kind of this change of the way that the party structure looks like. And yes, for Mr. Ishiba, of course, this is a problem. He now doesn't commend anymore a majority neither in the lower nor in the upper house. In other political systems, what this would lead to in Europe usually is that it would force the largest party to create a larger coalition, right? So one thing that was thinkable or that people talked about were that instead of just creating a coalition with the Komeito, because even together with them, they don't have an upper house majority anymore. You could just ask, Ishin or Sanseto and work with them, but that the LDP, they ruled that out from the beginning, especially the Sanseto is treated a bit in Japan the way that the AFD is treated in Germany, as in no, nobody can work with them, and actually nobody wants to work with them because they're too radical for many. Another thing that would have been thinkable is, of course, a grand coalition, although we haven't seen that before, in my view, between the LDP and the CDP. I'm not sure anymore if we ever had that, but this is also a possible scenario, right, in where they have a talk and say like, okay, let's work together, and you get a couple of seats in the cabinet, and we get a couple of seats, and then we coordinate policies. But for the moment, it looks as if though these parties are also reluctant to go into any kind of coalition with the ruling party that is currently deflating, right? Because you wouldn't want to stop the process of deflating, because you would be the direct beneficiary probably of a deflated LDP. So it looks as if though at the moment we have a kind of consensus, at least among the larger parties, that the LDP and Komeito together would form a minority coalition government. What does that mean? It means simply that these two parties, they don't command more than 50% of votes in parliament, but they are still the cabinet, which means the government overall will be relatively weak, because for Mr. Ishiba to get something through the two chambers, it will not be enough to just win, his own party and Komeito support. They will now have to talk to other parties as well, and the minimum that he needs is them not opposing his decisions or his policies, and which means more concessions. That's why I do think the biggest change we're seeing at the moment in the Japanese system is that it will force the current distribution of power will force even more consensus making across the party aisle. Now, one of the interesting things is that for the Japanese political debate, internal debate, is that none of the large parties, actually none of these parties here, seriously opposes social welfare policies. None of them. They're all pro-social welfare. The CDP, the DPP, Sanseto, the LDP, they are all pro social welfare. The thing that they disagree on is how to do social welfare. This is really like one of the largest differences to Europe and the US, in which the right-left divide is often, usually, about more social welfare or not. In Japan, one thing is clear, there will be more social welfare. The question is how. Some of the parties are in favor of direct payments. Let's just send everybody basically $200 on their bank accounts, which Japan, by the way, did during Corona. Suddenly in 2020, in summer, I got a letter. I filled in the letter, gave them my bank account, and 2 weeks later, I had the equivalent, roughly the equivalent at the time of $1,000 more on my bank account. That just happened. And they're thinking of doing that again, just direct handouts. They're also some of the parties, I think that's the CDP who would like to do it this way. The LDP and DPP, they are discussing like, should we not rather decrease the sales tax? So the VAT, the value-added tax, in Japan it's called sales tax. It was about 8 years ago, it was increased from 8 to 10%, and now the talk is how we get it back to 8%. And some of the other parties say like, nah, we should rather decrease the gasoline tax. So the talk is of how to hand out money, or how to make sure that the general public in Japan has more money in their hands. It's not if that should happen. And this is most surprising, of course, because Japan, is the country with the largest national debt in debt to GDP terms. Let me show you this here, a little graph from the International Monetary Fund, also like very good with data integration. Debt to GDP, right? The idea that you try to measure your the sovereign debt in terms of how much your country earns per year. And we have countries like Germany that are certainly in debt, 64.7%. So need to work. This is data for 2023, by the way. This is not the latest one, but the trend is we're pretty much at these points. The United States is at 120% of debt to GDP. The entirety of Japan would need of the United States would need to work for more than a year for free in order to pay back all of that debt. And let me just emphasize here, I think this is a stupid metric. I don't like this metric, but I give it to you because this is the mainstream narrative, right? A mainstream in the West, in Europe, and in the United States conceptualizes debt in terms of ratio to GDP. And Japan is at 250% now. It's over 250% of debt to GDP. It is world number one in terms of debt to GDP for its national debt. And again, I think Japan is doing this right, because it doesn't matter how much debt to GDP you have. Doesn't matter as long as you have a sovereign currency, as long as that debt is denominated in Japanese yen, which for the Japanese case it is. Most of this debt is in Japanese yen, and we have never had a moment in which Japan ever struggled to repay any of its outstanding debt, again because it has a sovereign currency, and the BOJ is very much in line with the government when it comes to making available funds. So Japan has been able to monetize its debt, or to do quantitative easing. And yes, this led to a large spike in terms of its debt. But on the other hand, it also made sure that Japan has a functioning economy. And the Japanese economy, despite having now inflation for the first time in 20 years, is still working pretty solidly and robustly, at least for the moment. So I do not think that this one here is a problem. And funnily enough, none of the parties actually really cares about this. They're all about, okay, what do we need money for, and how do we spend it? They do have an internal debate about where to get the money from, but most of these parties say like, okay, it's more important that we give people money so that they can buy stuff and be fine and support the economy, rather than increasing taxes and cutting benefits. That's just not a discussion inside Japan at the moment, which again is one of these things that not enough people outside of Japan actually know. So I do think we will continue to see a well expansionary monetary policy. We will see more fiscal spending on all fronts in Japan. Also for the security apparatus. That's one more. I mean, on the security front, we also see like social spending for sure, because none of these parties, especially not the large ones, are against this. So this is a very large difference to the CDU in Germany and the conservative parties in Europe, which all would love to slash down the welfare system to naught. Under the guise of we have no money and we need to rechannel money into the military. The Japanese, they kind of do both, although they are not going to a 5% spending target, not at all. They stick with their 2% spending target, which also is not a smart metric, but it's at least the Japanese are not trying to militarize completely over the top as the Europeans are doing. And in this sense, and in this context, I believe that we need to view this recent announcement that now Trump and Japan came to a agreement on to a trade agreement. The Mr. Ishiba was very hard pressed about this one, also because he didn't want to lose even more support in the upper house election than he already did. That it was a predicted loss, and it was a predicted decrease of LDP power. But had there been any kind of trade agreement that was viewed in Japan as unfavorable, then this might have cost him even more support. And unsurprisingly, the opposition parties, they're all criticizing now the announcement as, not good for Japan. But in fact, if we look at what we know so far, it doesn't strike me as that huge a deal, in fact. So the main thing is we don't have the treaty text yet. We don't know. And this treaty text needs to come out sooner or later. I mean, at some point you need to, the trade agreements and tariff agreements in Japan also need to pass through both chambers of the House. In my view, also in both chambers of parliament. In my view, that's also what should happen in the United States, although the US has been breaking with a lot of its legal and constitutional setup recently. But what the White House is giving us, a official fact sheet by the White House on the White House homepage, which in my view was clearly written by ChatGPT. You get this very clearly once you scroll through here. You get all of the information, and then you get the same information repeated again at the very end in very ChatGPT style and fashion, summarizing summarizing what was already said, and the bullet points and so on, and sub bullet points and all of the hyphens and so on used. This is like kind of this typical way in which ChatGPT expresses itself. So first, that I mean, whoever prepared this seems to be also running it through AI. This is an allegation. I don't know. It's just my personal interpretation from reading through this. The one thing this statement emphasizes the most is that Japan agreed to do a $500 billion investment into the United States. And that this is a super large concession from the Japanese in return for getting only 15% of additional tariffs slapped on Japanese products, especially Japanese cars, which are the sector that always has been dearest to Japan. You must understand, in around 10% of the Japanese economy, 10% of the production of this country is linked in one way or the other to the automotive industry, because it's not just the cars themselves. It's of course the engines, it's the chemistry surrounding that industry. It is the tires, it's the rubber. It's a car is made out of so many components, and these components, all of them have their own markets, right? And Japan has managed to have a presence on all of them. That that the automotive industry is just hugely important for Japan, and a decrease of even a little bit of revenue coming from abroad will have a ripple effect. And the United States knows that precisely, which is why they used these tactics. And it's not the first time, you know. Already in the 1980s, Japanese automotive and electronics makers were under direct assault by the by the United States. And usually, what Japan does is it tries to somehow make sure that its top margin exports that they remain fine, and it makes concessions on the lower margin exports. So in the 1980s, they voluntarily restricted the number of cars they would export, and what they did is they just exported more of the luxury and high end cars on which they have larger profit margins, and didn't export anymore the cheap cars, which mainly benefit lower income households in the United States. So the people who didn't have access anymore to cheaper cars were the lower income people in the US, whereas the Japanese still managed to hold and even increase their profit margins on the more expensive ones. And this time the deal to me seems to be a different one, because I didn't read anything yet about export restrictions that the Japanese would agree to only export a certain number of cars, but they seem to have agreed to basically bribe the US by pledging 550 billion US dollars in going into an investment vehicle, and then being invested into energy infrastructure, semiconductor manufacturing, critical minerals mining, pharmaceutical, medical production in the United States. And the White House is selling this as a huge win and victory that will revitalize the US economy. Now, the strange thing, of course, is that if the US agrees that Japan continues to sell cars to the United States, these cars will be sold, obviously, in United States dollars, just as trade usually works. You sell in the currency of the receiving country. What this means is that Japanese exporters, they earn US currency, and that US currency, usually you don't convert it back. I mean, you can convert it back to Japanese yen, but usually what you do is you then invest it in the economy that you export to, right? And you either reinvest into larger plans, or you buy stocks on the stock market, or you buy bonds on the bond markets, and thereby you earn a profit and a return on those on that capital, but you keep it inside that economy. So in a sense, having a FDI, a foreign direct investment agreement between Japan and the US, strikes me as something that probably the Japanese were not unhappy to do. Let me just say, at the last G7 meeting, Mr. Ishiba already announced that there would be or was it the one before that? I forgot. But there would be a $1 trillion investment into the United States, and it is unclear at this moment if the 550 are part of that, or if the 550 come on top of that. But Japan has never had a problem investing into the US. I think the US is actually the largest market it invests to, and also into US bonds, into US stocks. Japan has historically been very, very happy to invest into the United States, because the returns are actually also coming for them. So this, to me, has all the air of something that the Trump administration is now selling as a big victory, also because they need some form of trade agreement in order to with one of their main allies, in order to incentivize the others, like the Koreans and the Europeans, to come to an agreement, which haven't been doing, right? The US hasn't been very successful in coercing its trading partners. Now Japan is the first one. A downstream effect now is that, as for now, Japan has the promise that it will be able to sell its cars for 15% tariff on top of 2.5 to the US markets, but North American car makers, so imports from Canada and from Mexico, they still, at this moment, without an agreement, they will have a 25% tariff slapped on them. And this, of course, includes US car makers, because if they produce in, let's say, Mexico, and in Mexican factories in order to lower costs, then these kind of tariffs are in good parts also slapped on them. So in a sense, I do think the U.S. of course the Bassett and Trump, they will try to use this as leverage with the others and then lower these fees as well. But at the moment, the US is really creating quite some chaos on its own import market with different tariffs and different treatment of these countries. This is going to be a huge headache for the US as well. It also creates incentives still of the others to diversify away from the United States. This incentive won't go away. And to tell you the truth, I would be surprised if this trade agreement between Japan and the United States did survive actually the Trump administration. Because one thing we know for sure, which is that as soon as Donald Trump wakes up in the morning or something changes in the calculus, he will tear up this agreement and say like, oh, we were treated unfairly, or oh, you've lied to us, therefore everything is not. And the Japanese, they don't work like that. They actually operate under the premise that you need to negotiate, you need to make sure that the details are right, and then you stick to it and you run with it over the long term. I do think Japan will actually see that this agreement is maybe, I'm not sure, but it might be that it's not even worth the paper written on it, because the entire strategy might change overnight, and the United States could come up with completely new ideas, especially, for instance, direct capital controls. I interpret this agreement, and I talked recently also with Warwick Powell. He's also on that side as a precursor to direct capital controls, right? To make sure that capital and gains made in the United States remain in the US, and that the US has a say, the US government has a say on where they are invested. Because if we look at it, this White House readout actually speaks about an investment vehicle and a US say in where the Japanese are going to be allowed to invest in. But still, the fact that they will invest means that more US stocks, bonds, soil, or corporations are going to be owned one way or another by Japanese. So basically, this is the US agreeing to Japan owning more parts of the United States, although these ownerships can, at the discretion of the US government, of course, be changed at any point in time, although this is something that we haven't seen so far, but that would still be thinkable under the current administration. So with this said, there's still a question of whether or not Mr. Ishiba will continue as Japan's prime minister, but this isn't even that huge a story for me so far, because as we have seen, the main foreign policy issue with the United States, this trade agreement, seems now to converge toward a certain direction. And most importantly, the Japanese political system is one that I think will look more like the upper house looks at the moment. We will have more parties, we will have more people involved. So we will naturally have a less strong center, less powerful Japanese government. Whether that government is headed by Mr. Ishiba or somebody else, the basic arithmetic of needing to maintain somehow a balance, and maybe also shifting balances with shifting coalitions with parties over time, that will probably not change that quickly. The next test will be, of course, the next general elections, but which are a little bit away, unless Mr. Ishiba or whoever dissolves parliament. It's the power of the prime minister. Prime minister can send parliament home and said we are going to have a new general election. At the moment, I don't think he will do that. At the moment, I don't think the incentive is there, especially because the LDP currently still is the largest one in the lower house. So why touch that now when you know that you would only certainly lose voters? But who knows? Sometimes there are other calculations, and this might come, but my prediction is that for the time being, for the next year or so, we might see a change in leadership, a change of prime minister, but not of the parliamentary arithmetics, and we will see a Japan that is more diversified across the political spectrum, across the parties, and the diversification is not inside one of the parties anymore. So rather more consensus, more pressure toward consensus making. Not a right-wing, a far-right move of Japan. I don't interpret it as such, although the far-right, the Sanseto, definitely will have more of a say and will have an impact in the way that it shapes Japanese politics, but as so often, it will shape it in incremental ways, not salami slicing wise, but just insert its voice and insert some of its preferences into the overall policy discussion. That's my analysis. I hope it was helpful. See you next time.